Welcome to the deep dive.
Mm.
You sent over some really fascinating source material, these excerpts from Mark Galeotti's book, The Weaponization of Everything.
Mhm.
And reading it, well, it really paints this picture that the world we're living in now, the lines between war and peace are just incredibly fuzzy. It's not the old playbook anymore.
Not at all. That's really Galeotti's central idea, isn't it? That things we don't normally think of as weapons, economics, tech, information, even crime, culture states, are now using them as weapons. It's moved way beyond just tanks and missiles.
Yeah, you definitely feel that. You hear about, infrastructure hacks potentially taking down power grids or these really sophisticated disinformation campaigns trying to swing elections.
Mhm.
It feels current.
It is. Think about Russia taking Crimea back in 2014. That wasn't exactly a textbook invasion.
No, those ambiguous little green men, right?
Yeah.
Plus this huge info dump denying everything just long enough for them to cement control. Conflict in the shadows, sort of.
Exactly, the gray zone. Or look at the Palau example in the source material. All they did was reject Beijing's demand to drop diplomatic ties with Taiwan.
And the response wasn't military.
Nope. Economic warfare. A swift tourism boycott that just crushed their main industry. Forced them to totally rethink their economy. It shows how leverage works now.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. Let's try and unpack this new landscape Galeotti describes. We need to look at how economics, tech, supply chains, information, how they've all become battlegrounds.
Right, and understand why that shift makes things like, well, self-reliance or maybe strategic independence so critical for security now.
And maybe, just maybe, see if this new reality actually creates some unexpected opportunities too.
Okay, sounds good. So where do we start? Why this shift away from, traditional big wars?
Well, the source hits hard on cost and politics. Traditional warfare is just eye-wateringly expensive now.
Mm-hmm.
Think about this comparison. A World War II Spitfire cost about 12,500 pounds back then. That's maybe
Yeah.
822,000 pounds today. A single modern F-35, 92 million. You could have, what, over 100 Spitfires for one F-35? The scale is just different.
And the financial drain is immense. The U.S. war on terror, something like $6.4 trillion over 2 decades. Compare that to Vietnam, maybe $1 trillion in today's money. But it's not just the cash.
No, it's casualties too, right?
Yeah, public tolerance for casualties is way down, even in more authoritarian places. That pushes countries like Russia towards using proxies, mercenaries, less direct methods, keeps their own numbers low.
Yeah, and you get those weird economic mismatches the source mentioned.
Yeah.
Using a multi-million-dollar Patriot missile to shoot down a cheap drone you could buy online for a few $100.
Right. Militarily, sure, it works in the moment, but economically, as the source says, I'm not sure that's good. It's just not sustainable.
So if those big declared wars are less attractive now, too expensive, too bloody, where does that competition actually go?
Well, Galeotti argues it goes into the connections between states. Interdependence, the very thing we hoped would prevent war by linking economies and societies.
Has become the battleground itself.
Exactly. Your dependencies become your opponent's leverage points. Your vulnerabilities are their opportunities.
Which leads to this feeling of, what does he call it, permanent low-level conflict.
Yeah. It's often simmering below the surface of what we traditionally call war. Sometimes you don't even notice it. It's constant, undeclared competition. Even allies are doing it to each other. Victory is rare and often temporary.
It feels new, but the source points out it's not entirely without precedent. States have used non-military tools for ages.
Oh, absolutely. Think Renaissance Venice. They couldn't always take on the Ottomans head-on militarily.
So they used intrigue, disinformation.
Yep, intrigue, disinformation, even sponsoring terrorism to disrupt Ottoman trade routes and power, protecting their own interests indirectly.
And those Renaissance city-states, they weren't just fighting over land, they had cultural wars too, using scholars, texts.
For sure. Competing through patronage, funding art and scholarship to boost their own prestige, using historical arguments to claim legitimacy. There's that great quote about a Milanese leader saying one Florentine humanist's letters did more damage than 1,000 cavalry.
Words as weapons, even back then.
Absolutely. Which brings us neatly to the modern weaponization of economics and finance. These tools aren't just helping the military anymore. Sometimes they are the main end.
Like Napoleon trying to strangle Britain with his continental system, or the U.S. using trade embargoes way back in 1807 to avoid war. but sanctions feel like the big one today.
Definitely the most visible example. We've seen massive sanctions against Russia after Crimea, against Iran over its nuclear program. But, how well do they actually work?
That's the question, isn't it? The source seems pretty skeptical.
It raises good points. There are often blunt tools that can hammer the general population more than the regime elites.
Right, and authoritarian states seem pretty good at just absorbing the pain, maybe passing it down, and then using the sanctions to fuel nationalism.
Exactly. Rally around the flag. Putin's government reportedly covered losses for sanctioned oligarchs while the state media screamed about Russophobia to build that Fortress Russia narrative.
So the sanctions become proof of foreign hostility, reinforcing the regime's message.
Precisely. And look at the track record. Did sanctions stop Iran's nuclear ambitions entirely? Did they lead to regime change in places like Honduras? Not really.
So sometimes it feels like they're more about looking tough for a domestic audience than achieving a concrete foreign policy goal.
That's certainly an argument Galeotti presents. It can be about political signaling as much as tangible results.
Okay, but then there's the next level, weaponizing the system itself, the global financial plumbing.
This is where U.S. power really shows. The dollar's dominance, the control over key systems like SWIFT, that bank messaging network.
That gives Washington huge leverage.
Enormous leverage. It lets the U.S. project financial power globally, cut countries off, and naturally, others are pushing back.
The de-dollarization efforts.
Exactly. Russia, China, they're actively trying to reduce reliance on the dollar, dumping U.S. treasuries, building their own payment systems like Russia's SFS or China's CIPS.
And it's not just rivals.
Oh.
Even U.S. allies were trying to find workarounds for Iran sanctions, right? That Instex thing.
Yeah, Germany, France, the U.K. setting up Instex. It was a limited attempt, but it shows even allies want ways to operate outside the reach of U.S. financial sanctions if needed. Building resilience.
Okay, beyond sanctions and systems, there's just sheer economic size, what the source calls economic gravity.
Yeah, China's massive economy just pulls others into its orbit. The desire for access to that huge market, it can make countries hesitate to criticize Beijing's actions.
The examples are pretty stark. Germany's debate over Huawei and 5G, apparently heavily swayed by fears for their car industry in China.
Right. Or France getting pressured over meeting the Dalai Lama, suddenly trade visits, Airbus orders are canceled. French businesses then lean on their own government.
U.S. businesses did the same against Trump's tariffs, didn't they?
They did, complaining about the impact on their supply chains reliant on China. Galeotti suggests as this focus on short-term profit, this foreign greed, actually becomes an advantage for states like China. They can exploit that dependence.
It's influence through entanglement, almost.
Yeah.
And it's not just market access. Big spending works, too, like Saudi Arabia using huge arms deals.
To effectively buy political influence, turning foreign defense contractors into lobbyists back in their home countries, pushing the Saudi line. It's quite strategic.
So, okay, economic levers are clear. But the source goes further into weaponizing things like crime, aid, law. That feels even more insidious.
It does. Let's take crime first. How can states use criminals?
Yeah, how does that work?
Well, historically, the Soviets used criminals for espionage. Their allies used drug running for funds. Today, you see groups like Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps reportedly involved in smuggling to finance operations.
Or Venezuela allegedly cutting deals with traffickers.
Right. Galeotti mentions this gangster spook nexus. He cites older reports, like Canada's Operation Sidewinder back in the 90s, which suggested links between Chinese triads operating in Canada and Beijing's intelligence services.
So it's not just random crime, it's directed. A state tool.
That's the argument. It becomes a force multiplier. It generates off-the-books cash for secret ops, gives leverage to silence critics abroad, helps dodge sanctions, and can even pave the way for economic penetration infiltrating legitimate businesses.
Wow. Okay, what about aid? Humanitarianism, surely that's positive.
Mostly, yes. But it can be weaponized. Aid becomes a political carrot.
How so?
The source gives examples. U.S. pulls funding for Egypt's Aswan Dam back in the day. Soviets jump in, gain a crucial Cold War ally. Pakistan today skillfully plays U.S. and Chinese aid off against each other.
Even UN Security Council votes might be influenced by aid promises to temporary members.
That's suggested. It's using generosity for political gain. And then there's the darker side, denying aid.
Like the Syrian government bombing hospitals in rebel areas.
Oh, exactly. Or using migration flows as leverage. Gaddafi threatened Europe with migrants. Turkey has used the threat regarding Syrian refugees when facing criticism from the EU.
And the source points out the UK explicitly merged its aid department, the DFID, into the Foreign Office to maximize British influence. linking aid directly to political goals.
Precisely. It lays bare the intent. Align apparent altruism with hard-nosed national interest.
Okay, and the last one in this category, lawfare, using legal systems as weapons.
Another old trick. Modernized? Venice used legal claims against the Ottomans centuries ago.
And today, China in the South China Sea.
Perfect example. They don't just send ships. They build islands, make legal arguments based on historical claims, send maritime militia to contest reefs using quasi-legal actions to assert control.
Russia's Arctic claim, too, presenting it legally.
Right, and it's not just authoritarian states. The source notes U.S. sanctions are often called financial lawfare.
Even the U.S. military thought about affirmative lawfare in Afghanistan, using the law deliberately against insurgents who ignored it.
Yeah, General Martin's idea, though it was apparently hard to implement and largely abandoned, but it shows the thinking.
So, law can be used genuinely to uphold rules like using insurance law to stop that ship carrying weapons to Syria.
The MVL-led case, yeah.
But it can also be twisted into lawfare as a cynical tool of state power.
Exactly. Law becomes just another arena for competition alongside economics, crime, and aid.
Which I guess leads us to maybe the biggest battlefield of all today. Information and culture?
Definitely feels that way. Galeotti argues the game changed because we now have this single global information space. The old media gatekeepers, their power is way down. Everyone with a phone can be a broadcaster.
And the speed is just blinding. The source contrasts the Soviets taking like a decade to push the fake story that AIDS was a U.S. bioweapon, with China in 2020 pushing the COVID-19 as a U.S. bioweapon narrative globally in just days.
And it's incredible, and it underlines his point that modern conflict is increasingly a war of stories. It's not just about planting outright lies, disinformation.
It's also misinformation stuff that's wrong, but maybe not deliberately false, and using truths strategically.
Exactly. Leaking real but damaging emails for maximum disruption. And then there's the Russian concept the source mentions, infoshum. Info noise.
That's not about convincing people of the specific lie, is it?
Not necessarily. It's more about creating such a cloud of conflicting stories, alternative theories around things like the MH17 shoot-down or the Skripal poisonings that people just give up trying to find the truth.
It erodes confidence, makes it harder for other governments to react decisively because the public is confused.
Precisely. So chaos and doubt. And this info space is also used to shut people up. The source mentions the allegations around Jeff Bezos and the National Enquirer after the Washington Post's critical coverage of the Khashoggi murder, suggesting Saudi pressure.
Wow. And culture itself is a weapon, beyond just projecting power like with fancy art or space missions.
Yeah, influencing opinion directly. There are those old allegations about the CIA secretly backing the Scorpion song Wind of Change to encourage change in Eastern Europe. Or think about the huge impact of that Cunny 2012 documentary online. Cultural products shaping politics.
And censorship across borders.
Yeah.
China pressuring Western companies.
Right, telling a German book chain what not to stock, or the whole NBA Houston Rockets situation after one tweet, trying to control the global conversation about sensitive topics.
States even back films and video games now, like Top Gun or America's Army.
Absolutely. Boost recruitment, polish the military's image is all part of shaping the narrative.
So it's not just soft power attracting others through culture and values. There's also dark power.
Yeah, the opposite.
Yeah.
Making yourself seem too dangerous or unpredictable to mess with. Russia's heavy metal diplomacy, buzzing borders with bombers, simulating nuclear attacks. That fits.
North Korea's whole unpredictable act, too.
Exactly. Deterrence through calculated irrationality. Though Galeotti does add a crucial point. Authenticity matters in the long run.
You can't just project values you don't actually live by.
Not sustainably, no. Eventually, the gap shows.
Okay, so if this is the world constant multi-front competition using everything, how do states actually cope? What's the takeaway?
Imagination and flexibility are key, Galeotti says. You can't just think in military terms. The state needs to be more like a Swiss Army knife, adaptable, not just a hammer looking for nails. Security involves way more than just defense ministries now.
And this is where that idea of self-reliance comes back in strongly. Or maybe resilience, strategic independence. It becomes vital for security.
Absolutely essential. We've seen how interdependence creates these vulnerabilities. Supply chains, infrastructure like undersea cables, economic reliance, giving others political leverage like the Germany Huawei case. These can all be weaponized.
So reducing those dependencies, building resilience, maybe even reorienting like Palau did after the Chinese boycott, that becomes a core security strategy, even if it's painful initially.
Yes. enduring the shock to build a more stable, less dependent footing. It's about managing vulnerability in an interconnected world.
And this need for adaptation, for new kinds of resilience, that's where opportunities might arise, particularly for investment.
That's what Gagliotti suggests. He points to a few key areas that really flow from this new landscape.
Like what specifically?
Well, first, obviously, advanced cybersecurity and cyber espionage capabilities. That's huge.
Estonia's example, right? Turning attacks into expertise.
Exactly. It demands state investment, sure, but it builds a whole new strategic sector,
Yep.
both defensive and maybe offensive tools.
Okay, what else?
Another area is what he calls counter-weaponization services, especially in the private sector. Think AI and algorithms designed to detect and block online manipulation, fake accounts, troll farms.
Fighting the infosham and disinformation campaigns.
Right. He explicitly flags this as an area needing development and investment, a direct response to the weaponization of information.
That makes sense. Anything else?
He also talks about states developing strategic niche capabilities, finding specific areas where they can excel and gain influence, punch above their weight.
Like South Korea focusing on green tech.
Exactly. That's a domestic investment, but it has security payoffs, reducing fossil fuel reliance, and gives them geopolitical clout as a leader in a critical future industry.
So while the source doesn't explicitly list things like, say, semiconductors or local manufacturing as investment areas,
No, not directly by those names.
the underlying idea of building strategic independence implies a need for resilience in those critical areas, right? Secure supply chains, domestic capacity, and vital technologies.
I think that's a fair reading. The principle is clear. Identify critical dependencies that could be weaponized and build resilience against them. That might involve fostering domestic industries, diversifying suppliers, investing in key technologies. So opportunities could certainly arise in sectors that support that resilience.
So strategic investment in areas that build that resilience, whether it's cyber defense, counterpropaganda tech, or shoring up critical supply chains, it becomes less just an economic decision and more a core part of national security strategy itself.
Precisely. It's about adapting to this weaponized world. It takes imagination, as Gagliotti says, but for those who can develop these needed capabilities and services, there are real opportunities.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive into Gagliotti's weaponization of everything, the big picture is pretty clear. War and peace aren't separate categories anymore. Economics, finance, crime, aid, law, information, culture, it's all potentially part of the conflict toolkit now.
Yeah, and that reality forces states to adapt drastically. They need to think beyond just the military, build resilience against these new forms of attack through interdependence, and achieve a degree of strategic independence.
And while that sounds challenging, maybe even a bit bleak, it also carves out new spaces for innovation, for investment, particularly in areas like cybersecurity, information integrity, and strategically vital technologies and industries that underpin that resilience.
Definitely. And Gagliotti ends with this sort of chilling reminder, echoing Machiavelli. War should be the only study of a prince. He should consider peace only as a breathing space.
Oof. So even peace is just a pause in the competition.
That's the implication. Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe for you listening. In this world where everything can be a weapon, where peace might just be strategic downtime, how much of the burden for understanding and navigating all this rests not just on governments or companies, but on you? You as an individual trying to make sense of the information flood, participating in the global economy, navigating these weaponized narratives.